watching as you were following along with the Shir HaShirim text, maybe, I don't know. You don't have to go too far under the hood to get to the symbolism of it. You know, I really feel like it's one of the oddest and most unexpected moments in the history of Jewish thought, you know, Judaism as a religion, that at some point, let's say it's probably 2,300 years ago, that a decision was made to add the Song of Songs into the Tanakh, into the Hebrew Bible. Why odd? Because as you just saw, what it really is a passionate love poem, maybe even you could call it a lust poem. It's a description of two young lovers searching for one another through the streets of Jerusalem in ancient times, dreaming about one another, desiring one another, and the language of the poem, when the two meet, describes their trysts very erotically. I mean, it really is a kind of erotic love poem. So imagine this for a second, okay? Again, some 2,200 years ago, there was a committee meeting somewhere, okay, in the boardroom, right? In the Baum boardroom, discussing which books should get into the Bible and which would not get into the Bible. And someone on that committee makes a pitch for Song of Songs, for Shir HaShirim. And it worked, okay? And it worked. And we actually have a record of that meeting. We have the minutes. We do. We have the minutes. We have the minutes of that meeting. It's in the Mishnah. It's in Tractate Yadayim. And a number of the rabbis that we just read about Saturday and Sunday night in our Haggadah, as we were sitting at the Passover Seder, the story of the rabbis, the 5 rabbis in Bnei Barak, a number of those rabbis, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva, among them, are talking about whether Song of Songs should go into the Bible or not. And it is a debate that's going back and forth. They're talking about other books as well. And in the course of the discussion, Song of Songs comes up. And at that point, Rabbi Akiva, who we understand is one of the great sages of all time in our tradition, Rabbi Akiva chimes in and he says this. He says, about the Song of Songs, there is no dispute. It is universally beloved by every person in Israel. And then he goes on to say this, Rabbi Akiva, the whole world is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. For, listen to this, for all the writings are holy. In other words, all the books in the Bible are holy, or maybe just in Ketuvim, but all the writings are holy. But the Song of Songs, he says, is Kodesh HaKodeshim, the holiest of any of the books, the holiest of any of the books. That is a strong statement by Rabbi Akiva. And on the surface, it's puzzling statement as well, I would say. How could an erotic love poem be considered the holiest book in the entire Bible? And in part, the answer has to do, so on the one hand, with how Rabbi Akiva understood the book, how he sort of understood it exegetically in terms of parsing out the text. And he reimagined it not as a love story of two young people, but rather as an allegory about the love, the eternal love that exists between God and Am Yisrael and the Jewish people. And that's why we read the Song of Songs at Passover, by the way. So traditionally, the Shabbos of Chol HaMoed Pesach, this year there is no Chol HaMoed Pesach Shabbos, but traditionally the text is read during the Passover season, because what greater sign is there of God's love for Israel than the fact that God redeemed us from slavery, took us out from Egypt, and brought us to the Promised Land. And so Rabbi Akiva says Song of Songs is a reflection of that moment. That's the symbol. God's taking note of us, taking us out of slavery, taking us to Eretz Yisrael, the Promised Land. That's the symbol of God's love for us indeed. And the text that symbolizes it is Shir HaShirim, is the Song of Songs. But I think also Rabbi Akiva won this argument so long ago because the other sages in the room already knew that Judaism was interested in the idea of love. That Judaism was interested in the idea of love. And so it made sense when Rabbi Akiva brings this argument forward. It made sense to the sages who were putting together the final form of the Hebrew Bible to include a book that was focused on the idea of love. Okay? How do you say love in Hebrew, by the way? Ahava. It's light sconce right there, right? The Aleph light sconce. So the sages were already familiar with the idea that Judaism has love as an important concept. Here's a book that focuses on it, so they say, okay, makes sense. Let's put it in, particularly if they understand the book is to be about the relationship, the love relationship between God and Israel. So in what way, then, is Judaism interested in love? And there are three specific ways, actually, that Tanakh suggests. Three specific ways that the Bible, really the Torah, suggests. Two of them you're already familiar with. One probably a little bit less so. But to introduce the first of the two love concepts from Torah, I want to just tell you a brief story. Many years ago now, more than 20, probably almost 25 years ago, I wake up one morning, so long ago that I had a Palm Pilot, okay? You remember what Palm Pilots were? So I wake up, I look at my Palm Pilot, and there's a cryptic note in my Palm Pilot. It says, McDonough School, 8 a.m. I have no idea why, no memory of it at all. But I figure I better go over to McDonough School. So I put a tie and jacket on, which is what we wore every day in those days. I drive over to McDonough School. I arrive there. I find the main office. And I say, I'm Rabbi Schwartz. I'm from Beth El. I'm not exactly sure why I'm here, but I have a note in my, and the woman says, oh yeah, there's an assembly. There's a middle school assembly. And I'll take you down to the teacher who's coordinating the assembly. So I'm taken down to the teacher. I don't remember the teacher's name. I'm in the teacher's office, and I said, would you mind just reminding me a little bit what's the... And he said, oh, there's a Christian pastor here today, and she's going to talk about Christianity, what's important in Christianity, and then you'll talk about Judaism and what's important in Judaism. I said, okay, great. Do you have a piece of scrap paper? And so sure enough, he gives me a piece of scrap paper. I jot 2 or 3 things down on the paper, and he takes me up into this state-of-the-art, brand new assembly hall at McDonough, and the entire middle school comes in with parents and some grandparents and all the teachers. It's like 400 people in the room. The Christian pastor gets up, and the first thing that happens is this huge 15-foot screen slides down behind her, and she has a full PowerPoint prepared. This is Emmis. This is true story. And she says this, using slides. She says, there are 2 things you have to know about Christianity. The first thing is, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. She says, you know that verse, love the Lord your God. And the second thing she says that you have to know is, V'ahavta et re'echa kamocha. You need to love your neighbor as yourself. She says those, now she doesn't say them in Hebrew. Okay? But that's what she said. And then she talks more about Christianity, but she said those are the 2 fundamental pillars of Christian life. Okay? Okay. So she sits down, and I get up, and I pull up my little paper, and I put it down. I kind of spread it out. But I was able to, because she had talked about those 2 things, begin my remarks by saying what my pastor friend just said. She actually quoted 2 verses from the Hebrew Bible. One of the verses from Deuteronomy 6, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, love the Lord your God. And then you know the rest with all of your heart, with all of your strength. And V'ahavta et re'echa kamocha, V'ahavta re'echa kamocha, which comes from Leviticus 19, 18, maybe Leviticus 18. And that enabled me to make the comments that I needed to make. Nobody died, and it was fine. So, again, you're very familiar with those two ideas. So is the Christian pastor. And you're familiar with them because you recite them all the time. The Shema, the V'ahavta paragraph, you say, if you're a traditional Jew, twice a day, you probably have that memorized. And the love your neighbor as yourself paragraph, which over time sort of transmuted into the famous golden rule, you know that as well. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's talked about all the time. It's talked about all the time. Sermons, classes, whatever. It's one of the verses in the Tanakh that Jews are very proud of. But there's a third kind of love in the tradition, which the Christian pastor didn't talk about, and I would argue that it's the third love pillar of Jewish life. It's less often discussed and less often thought about, and probably is best expressed by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, giving the Israelites a last message, his last thoughts that he wants to give them before they'll go into the promised land, and he'll go to the top of Mount Nebo at the end of his life. And here's what Moses says to them. And this I want to look at with you in the Chumash. Take a look. It's on page 1049. 1049 in the Chumash. So you're in Deuteronomy chapter 10. And if you can find verses 18 and 19. Deuteronomy 10, 18 and 19. I'll pick up at 18. But upholds the cause, again it's page 1049, verse 18. But upholds the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and befriends the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. And then verse 19, you too must befriend the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Okay. Now you could fairly say to me at this point, Rabbi, that's very nice, but it doesn't talk about love at all. Well, if you look on the Hebrew side of the page, you'll see that for some reason the translator chose an odd translation, because the Hebrew says the ohev ger, meaning you should love the stranger. And then at the beginning of verse 19, the Hebrew also says the ahavtem et hager, that you should love the stranger. The root, aleph, hey, vet, is the Hebrew root again, ahava. It means to love. Here with the passage, I don't know why, the translator takes that same root, which clearly on the Hebrew side says you should love the stranger, and the translator chooses to translate that as to befriend, to befriend. The Hebrew is very strong, actually, particularly the second phrase, the havtem et hager. I mean, that's a mitzvah. You know, that's language of mitzvah. It's considered to be a commandment. The word is love and not befriend. Love. Now, why did the translator make that choice? Get back to odd things. I think it's an odd choice. And maybe it's because of this. It's relatively easy to love your fellow. V'ahavta re'echa kamocha. Love your fellow, your neighbor, like yourself. Love your family, love your friend, love your community, love your tribe. Relatively easy. Loving God, I don't know. Maybe that's easy too. But to love the stranger is hard. Loving the stranger is hard. Certainly the hardest of the three, I think. And maybe that's why the translator changed the translation from love to befriend. The translator's saying, I'm not going to tell you to love the stranger. I know that's hard, but I'll tell you, just befriend them, and that'll kind of move you along in the right directions. And one of the things that I love about our tradition is that it knows how we think, our tradition. It knows how we think. And it knows that we all too often and too easily give in to our worst tendencies: fear, anxiety, distrust, suspicion. And those things can rise to the surface very easily in our hearts and in our minds. And that our inclination might be to say, you know, we'll just take care of our own, but those we don't know, like the strangers in our midst, we're not going to worry about them. They don't need to be on our radar screen. We can turn our backs on them and let them figure out their own problems and their own challenges. After all, what responsibility do we have for them? They're not us. And the tradition, knowing so well the inner workings of the hearts and minds of the human being, comes along to say, yes, v'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, yes, love the Lord your God, and yes, v'ahavta re'echa kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Yes, but yes, also the stranger you must love. Also the stranger you must love. V'ahavtem et hager. Very clear. Why? Because only a tradition that rests on all three of those pillars can build a society of justice and fairness for all people. That's the only way you can do it. And only a tradition that rests on all three of those pillars can dare to dream of, and one day bring into being a world of shalom, a world of peace. Shabbat shalom.